I learned to smile to hide my fear, because crying never changed a thing. For years, I lived in silence, under a shadow that controlled every breath I took. But one night, a secret my mother left behind shattered everything I thought I knew. This is my story, a story of fear, lies, impossible promises, and the courage it took to finally break free. Watch closely. You're about to see how far survival the exact sound can push a soul searching for freedom. The hum of the old refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the faint wind brushing the curtains like someone breathing too close to my skin. I was 16, barefoot on the cold kitchen floor, staring at the yellow light flickering above me. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from what I had just heard. You better learn to smile, girl. No one likes a crying face. She didn't need my mother's the voice. Silence after her words hit harder, almost than any slap ever could. That was the night I learned something that would follow me for years. Crying didn't change anything. Not the way my father looked at me. Not the way my mother avoided my eyes. Not the way the house breathed tension into every corner. So I smiled every day, every photograph, every visit to the neighbors. My smile became my disguise, neat, polite, practiced in front of the bathroom mirror until it looked almost natural. Almost. We lived in a small house in the outskirts of Belo Horizonte, on a street where everyone knew each other but pretended not to. The kind of place where gossip moved faster than the wind. My father worked at a car parts shop downtown. He left early, came back late. My mother spent her days and ironing clothes for the neighbors and listening to soap operas on the radio. From the outside, we looked like a family, quiet, simple, maybe even happy. But inside, our walls had heard more confession than any church. There were days when my mother's silence spoke louder than anything. She'd fold shirts without looking up, her eyes red but dry. She'd say, "Don't make every things time worse, I tried Menina. To speak, just stay my father's quiet." Chair would I creak. Did. And that sound alone was enough to make my words die before reaching my lips. He wasn't always cruel. Sometimes he brought home bread from the bakery, or an orange soda if he was in a good mood. But kindness from him was like rain in July, rare, confusing, and gone before you could believe it happened. I started to find peace in small rituals, hanging the laundry just right, aligning the plates in the cupboard, memorizing the exact second when the sun touched the window frame. Control, that's what I craved, because when you live with fear, control feels like safety. I told myself that if I could make everything perfect, maybe the shouting would stop. Maybe the house would breathe again. But it never did. I learned how to smile. I became when relatives came at over, pretending. How to laugh at my father's jokes even when my stomach clenched. How to look grateful when my mother said, "Be patient. One day it'll get better." I believed her for years, until I didn't. One evening, after dinner, my father asked me to bring him his cigarettes. He was sitting in the armchair, the TV blaring some news about the price of gasoline. When I handed him the pack, he looked at me with this strange softness, the kind that made me think maybe, just maybe, he remembered I was his daughter. But then, out of nowhere, he said, "You should learn to act like your mother. She knows her place." And that softness turned into something cold, something that crawled inside me and stayed there for years. That night, after they went to bed, I looked at
My
myself
face felt
in the
heavy,
mirror,
my
and tried
chest
to
tight,
cry.
but
But
nothing
nothing
came out.
just that same frozen smile. I whispered to myself, maybe this is what being strong means. But deep down, I knew it wasn't strength. It was survival. Years later, when people told me they admired how calm I was, how I always smiled no matter what, they had no idea what that smile cost me. They saw peace. I saw armor. And
They
every
saw
time
grace.
someone said,
I saw fear
"You're
dressed
so
as
strong,"
patience.
I wanted to scream, "No, I'm just scared of what happens when I stop smiling." That night marked the beginning of a long performance, one I didn't even know I was giving. And I was good at it, too good, until one day, someone saw through it. The years that followed felt like one long Sunday afternoon, slow, heavy, and filled with the kind of quiet I that was presses
17
against your skin
when I started
until
working
you
at
can't breathe.
Donacelis
Bakery downtown. It wasn't glamorous. Flour on my hands, hair tied up, old radio humming boleros in the background. But it was my escape. The smell of bread rising in the oven became my proof that something could grow, even in a place that felt dead inside. I earned 45 cruzeros a week, barely enough to buy my bus fare
at the bakery
and a few notebooks.
I learned how to
but
listen.
it was freedom.
People confess
even if
things
only
over
for
coffee
a few hours
they'd
a
never
day.
say at home.
A woman came in every morning at 7, bought 2 cheese rolls, and whispered into the air, "He didn't come home again." A man with tired eyes ordered black coffee and stared at his wedding ring like it was burning his skin. I memorized every detail, the trembling hand, the fake laughter. I was surrounded
the heavy
by
silences,
people, maybe because I recognized myself
just like
in
me.
all of them.
Back
home, nothing changed. My father still ruled the house with silence and stares. My mother still folded herself smaller every year. And me, I became the peacekeeper. I cooked dinner. I washed the dish. I smiled when my father made cruel jokes. And I swallowed every word that could start a fight. By 19,
It's strange
I
how
had
you
mastered
can be
the
so
art
quiet
of disappearing
that people
while
forget
still
you're
being
there.
in the room, yet still hear everything. Once, I overheard my father telling my mother that I was too soft to survive in the world. He said I had her heart, but none of her obedience. I waited for her to defend me, but she didn't. She just said, "She'll learn." That sentence echoed in my head for years. She'll learn. As if pain was something I
When
was
my
supposed to
coworkers
study.
asked about
My
practice,
family.
and
I
perfect,
said,
but
"We're
I did
fine."
learn.
When
I
boys
learned
tried
how
to
to
get
lie
close,
with grace.
I smiled and pulled away before they could see the fear in my eyes. When people said, "You're always so composed," I told them it was my mother's influence. The truth was, it was my father's shadow that taught me composure. The stillness you adopt when you grow up walking on eggshells. One day,
I held those
I
notes
got my first
like
paycheck
they were the
in
keys
cash,
to another
45
life.
cruzeros. I remember walking home past the bus terminal, seeing all the people rushing, men in suits, women with grocery bags, children eating ice cream. I wanted to be one of them, just ordinary, just free. I thought about buying myself a small perfume from the pharmacy. I even held it in my hands. Lavender DA Provence. The house
But then I
needed
put it
silence
back.
more than
My
I
mother
needed
needed
scent.
soap.
By
My
the time
father
I
needed
turned
cigarettes.
22, I'd saved enough to dream. Not much, just a few crumpled notes hidden in a tin under my mattress. I wanted to move out, maybe rent a small room near the bakery. I even went to see one. Pale walls, a single window, a bed too small for dreams, but it was mine, or could have been. When I told my mother, and just
Her
like
eyes
that,
filled with
my
something
dream
between
died.
pride
I
and
told her
fear.
I'd
She
stay a little
whispered,
longer.
"Don't leave
That
me here
little
alone
turned
with
into
him."
5 more years. I lost count of how many birthdays passed in that house, how many smiles I forced, how many nights I whispered to the ceiling, "This can't be all there is," but the walls never answered. Only the clock, ticking the same way it did the night I was 16. Time moved, but we didn't. My father's hair turned gray, my mother's back bent lower, and I became a ghost with perfect manners. It's strange how silence becomes a language when you speak it long enough. I could tell what kind of night it would be just by the way my father closed the door. A soft click meant peace. A slam meant danger. I learned to read footsteps like letters, to hold my breath at the sound of a bottle opening, to pretend to
My
sleep
whole
when
life
voices
became a
rose.
collection
Of small acts of survival, quiet one, invisible one. And yet, somewhere deep inside, something refused to die. A small, stubborn spark that whispered, "There must be more." I didn't know it then, but that whisper was the beginning of everything that came next. The lies, the breaking, the discovery that would change everything I thought I
It
knew
was a
about my
Wednesday
family in late March
and
of
about
1992 when everything began to shift. Not sudden, but in that quiet, unsettling way that change often does. The heat was suffocating, the kind that made the curtains stick to the window pane and turned every breath into effort. I was 23, still working at the bakery, still living in that same house that felt more like a cage than a home. My mother had started coughing that year, a dry, persistent cough that echoed through the walls at night like a reminder of something we didn't want to name. She refused to see a doctor. "It's just dust from the clothes," she'd say, her voice thin, her eyes heavy. But one afternoon, when she fainted while hanging laundry, I knew it wasn't dust. It was something else, something bigger. I ran to her side. My father didn't move from his chair as I tried to wake her. He just stared at the television, the reflection of the screen flickering across his face like nothing had happened. At the hospital, the doctor's words were calm but final. "She needs rest, proper food, and less stress. Her lungs are weak, maybe tuberculosis." I felt my stomach twist. I looked at her lying there on that narrow bed, her body so
always
small
smiling
under the sheets.
That same
She
smile
smiled
when
I had
she
learned
saw
to
me.
copy, the one that hides pain and says everything's fine. That night, as I helped her into bed, she reached for my hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly. "Promise me you'll take care of him," she whispered. I froze. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. "Take care of who?" I asked, but I already knew the answer. She looked
"He won't
toward
know
the
what
living
to
room
do without me,"
where my father
she said
sat in the
softly.
dark.
"He's
A
not
glass of
strong,
cachaca glinting in his hand.
You must
stay. It was the cruelest kindness she could have offered, a mother's love twisted into a burden. I wanted to scream, "He's never taken care of us." Why should I? But the words stayed buried in my throat. Because she was looking at me the way she used to when I was little, when I fell, and she patched
And
my
I
knees
couldn't
with
break
old
her
cloth,
heart,
and
not
whispered
when it
that
was already
everything would be
breaking
okay
on its
own. So I promised. I promised to take care of him. I promised to stay. I promised to keep smiling so she wouldn't see the truth in my eyes. It was an impossible promise, and I kept it. After she passed, the house changed overnight. Her scent, lavender soap and starch, faded slowly, replaced by the sharp
He just
bitterness
sat by
of
the
alcohol.
window,
My
silent,
father's grief
drinking,
was strange,
as if
he
time
didn't
had
cry.
stopped.
I
Didn't
thought
speak her
maybe
name.
he'd soften. Maybe losing her would make him see what he still had. But grief doesn't make everyone kinder. Sometimes it turns them into their worst selves. Within weeks, he started calling for me more. Not kindly, not with affection, just that voice, rough and commanding. "Girl, bring me this." But there was a new
clean
weight
that.
in the
I
air.
did what
One
I'd
that
always
made my
done,
skin crawl.
obeyed,
His eyes
endured,
lingered longer
waited.
than before. His words slurred into something darker. One night, he grabbed my wrist too tightly. Just for a second, but enough for me to feel the warning behind it. I wanted to leave. Every part of me screamed to run. But that promise, that cursed promise, I could still hear her voice in my head, fragile, pleading.
Dying.
And the days
Take
began
care
to
of
blur
him.
into one
So
another.
I stayed.
The radio static, the dripping faucet, the sound of his footsteps behind me. I told myself it was just grief, that he didn't mean it, that if I just stayed quiet a little longer, maybe he'd go back to the way things were. But he didn't. He started drinking earlier in the day. The neighbors began whispering about the shouting they heard at night. I stopped going to the bakery. The little
as
money I
often.
had saved went to groceries, to his cigarettes, to keeping the illusion alive. Then, one evening, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, I caught my reflection in the window. My face looked older, harder, the same forced smile, the same hollow eyes, and I whispered to myself, "You promised her, but she never promised you'd survive it." That night, something inside me cracked. I just felt
quietly,
the first real pulse of
invisibly.
rebellion. I didn't cry,
Faint
but I didn't
undeniable.
scream. A voice that said, "You've kept your promise long enough. It would still take me months to act on it." But that was the moment the idea was born. The idea that maybe I could leave, that maybe I deserved to. I didn't know then that the truth waiting for me would shatter everything, not just the promise, but the very idea of who I thought my family was heavy. It happened and on the world outside my window felt swollen and with cigarette smoke. I was 24, and for the first time since my mother's death, I had started sleeping with the light on. It wasn't fear of the dark. It was fear of what my mind would do in the dark. My father had been drinking more, talking to himself, calling my mother's name like she might still answer. Some nights, it wasn't I almost unusual. Wished she would. He that often evening, stayed at the bar near the corner store, where the jukebox never stopped playing Roberto Carlos songs that used to make my mother hum along. But this time, something felt off. There was a smell in the air of something ending. I couldn't explain it. I waited. Midnight came, then 1, then 2. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the chipped tiles, the ones my father promised he'd replace, the clock but never did. And I felt the old familiar silence wrap itself around me like a noose. I finally got up to lock the front door when I heard the sound, a dull thud, followed by a scraping noise. My heart leapt. I ran to the porch and found him there, slumped against the gate, his shirt soaked through with rain and something darker. For a second, I thought he was dead. His skin was pale. Then I saw the blood, his lips moving not with his words, but smeared across his hands. My breath caught. I helped him inside, his weight collapsing against me. He reeked of alcohol and despair. I sat him on the couch, my hands shaking. What happened? I asked, but he didn't answer. He just stared at me with those hollow eyes that used to terrify me as a child. Then, in a voice that barely sounded human, at first, he said, I she thought lied he meant to me. My mother. That grief had finally broken what was left of him. But then he grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin. You lied to me too, he hissed. His breath was hot, foul. I pulled away, terrified. He shouted, words slurring together, something about betrayal, about how nothing was real. Then he threw a small wooden box at the wall. It cracked when he finally on passed the floor, out, scattering down papers and started picking up the mess. Not out of curiosity at first, but habit. Always cleaning, always fixing what he broke. But as I gathered the papers, I froze. Among them was an envelope with my mother's handwriting. Faded, delicate, the ink almost gone. My name on the front. Para minha filha, quando união esteve mais aqui. Inside my was hands a letter. Went numb. For pages, I sat on the floor, folded carefully, and opened it yellowed slowly, at the edges, afraid that even the air might tear it. And with every line, the ground beneath my life began to shift. She wrote about love, about mistakes, about a secret she carried for years because she thought the truth would destroy us. And then, in the second page, came the words that made my vision blur. Your father is not the man you believe he is. The clock stopped and he's ticking. Not the man or maybe who gave I you just life. Stopped hearing the it. World my hands silent. Trembled as I read the rest. She spoke of a man she met before my father, when she was still young, still full of dreams. A man who left without knowing she was pregnant. My father had married her months later, believing I was his. She tried to tell him once, but fear and love silenced her. I read it again and again. The man until I had feared my entire life wasn't even my father. The man I had promised to care for. The man whose anger shaped every breath I took. He had been living a lie too. I didn't know what to feel. Anger, relief, betrayal. All I knew was that the world suddenly made sense in the worst possible way. The distance in his eyes, the disgust in his voice when he looked at me, the way my mother always shielded me. I stayed up all night, even when it cost the letter her. Trembling in my hands. When the first light crept through the window, I looked at him, passed out on the couch, empty bottle on the floor, his face twisted in something between pain and hate. And I realized something that felt both liberating and cruel. I didn't owe him anything. Not my care, not my silence, not my smile. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to cry, not the quiet, hidden tears of a child, but raw, shaking sobs that tore through the walls, the kind that didn't ask for permission. I cried for my mother, for the years I lost, for the girl who learned to smile instead of scream. When I finally stopped, the sun had risen. I folded the letter, tucked it into my pocket, and whispered
No
to the
suitcase,
empty house, "No plan, I'm leaving. Just and a small bag with the letter. Meant it. A change of 2 nights later, and 70 cruzeros I'd hidden inside an old coffee tin. It was a Thursday, the kind of night that looked ordinary to everyone else, but felt like the end of the world to me. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of rain-soaked earth, and the moon hid behind a layer of clouds thick enough to keep my secrets. Just when I thought I had escaped, the one the past who found my life again with silence and anger appeared in front of, and the truth hit harder than any wall I had ever faced. What happens when the shadows of your childhood refuse to let you go? Stay with me, because the story is far from over, and the real discovery is about to unfold. He was asleep on the couch again, half-empty bottle on the table. The television there for a long moment. The sound filled the room. The man like a dying heartbeat. The man I once called father. His chest rose and fell in slow, uneven breaths. For the first time, I didn't feel fear, just emptiness. A hollow space where years of obedience used to live. I took off my shoes so the floorboards wouldn't creak. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might wake. Every step felt like walking through my own memories. The corner where he broke the plate when my mother spoke too loudly. The doorframe I used to measure my height against. The kitchen where she whispered, "Be patient, fill her." I wanted to say goodbye to her ghost, but the words wouldn't come. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she'd been waiting for this moment as much as I had. I stepped out into the street and felt the cool air, the sound of the crickets, sharp, the hum almost of the distant city, even the faint barking of a dog somewhere far away. Everything felt new, alive. For a moment, I thought about turning back. I imagined him waking up, realizing I was gone, shouting my name. But then I remembered the letter, the truth, the years. I kept walking. The bus station was nearly empty when I arrived. Neon lights buzzed overhead. I went to the painting
counter
everything in
and
that
asked
sad
for
blue
the
glow
cheapest ride
that
leaving
makes
that
even
night.
freedom
The
look
man
tired.
behind
The glass barely looked up. Montes Claros leaves in 15 minutes. I didn't even know what waited there. I just nodded, handed him the money, and took the ticket like it was a passport to another version of myself. As I sat on the hard plastic bench, I opened my bag and unfolded the letter one last time.
You are more
I
than
read
what
her
this
words
house
silently
made you,
when the
mouthing
bus
them
like
arrived.
a prayer. I climbed aboard and sat by the window. The seat smelled of dust and cheap cologne. Outside, the world looked blurred, maybe from the rain, maybe from the tears I didn't want to admit were falling again. The engine roared to life, and as the city lights began to fade behind me, I realized I wasn't scared anymore. I was something else. For the
Something
first
fierce
time
and fragile at
I
once.
allowed myself to imagine a life without fear. A small apartment, maybe, a steady job, a morning without shouting, the possibility of laughter that didn't come with guilt. But even as those thoughts flickered, a strange weight settled in my chest. Guilt, yes, but something deeper. Because leaving didn't erase him. It didn't erase the years. It didn't erase what he had done. Somewhere
Or what
around
I
dawn,
had promised.
I woke to find the bus stopping at a roadside diner. The driver shouted something about coffee and bathroom breaks. I stepped outside, stretching my legs, and looked at the horizon. The first light was breaking, thin, pink, and soft, the way hope looks when it's still unsure of itself. I felt the urge to cry again, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was from disbelief. I sat near the window inside the diner at the people around me. Coffee, a mother feeding her child, burning, a young couple laughing, two truck drivers arguing about soccer. Ordinary lives. For years, I had watched people like this and wondered what it felt like to be normal. Now, sitting there with a chipped mug in my hands, I realized I had no idea who I was without the fear, and that terrified me. Freedom isn't always a door opening. What to do sometimes with that silence. It's the silence. It felt too big, too empty. You walk through but inside that emptiness, there was a whisper, faint but growing. You did it. I finished my coffee, got back on the bus, and watched the road unfold before me. Mile after mile, the distance between me and that house grew wider. Yet, somewhere deep down, I knew the past wasn't done with me. There were still questions about the man she loved, about who I really was, about whether running away was enough to finally stop the echoes of that house. But for now, I didn't need answers. I just needed the road. And as the bus carried me further from the life I once knew, I pressed my hand against the window and whispered, I'm still smiling, May, but this time, it's real. Montes Claros was smaller than I imagined. Me off just after noon, slower, the sun blazing as if high, time itself had the asphalt to shimmering walk with barefoot heat. There, I stepped out carrying my bag, squinting at the unfamiliar streets. There was something strangely comforting about not being recognized by anyone. For the first time in my life, no one knew my name, my story, or the weight I carried. I found a small boarding house 2 blocks from the bus terminal. pensar das
The woman who
flores.
ran it,
A
Donna
faded sign
Lords,
said,
looked at me
though
with
there
suspicion
wasn't a
first,
single flower
then
in
pity.
sight.
You alone, Menina? She asked. I nodded. She shrugged, handed me a key, and said, Room 7. Pay weekly, no trouble, no question. That was fine by me. I had no answers to give. The room smelled of mothballs and dust, but the bed was clean, and the window open to a view of a mango
Just
tree.
quiet. I sat
Safe.
there for a
Still,
long time.
my mind
just
wouldn't
breathing.
stop.
The
I
silence
thought of
was
the
different
letter,
here.
of my
Not
mother's
heavy like at
handwriting
home,
trembling on that
not
paper,
full of threat.
of the name she never mentioned, the man who was my real father. She hadn't written much about him, only a few sentences. He was kind. He made me laugh when I had forgotten how. He wanted to leave for Sao Paulo, and I was too afraid to go with him. When I found out I
Just
was
a
memory,
pregnant,
sealed
too
and
late.
buried. But
For
he
days,
deserved to know.
I walked through
then
the city
nothing,
trying to find
no
work,
name, no
anything
address.
to keep
my mind busy. The bakery near the main square took me in after I told them I had experience. The owner, Sue Morrow, was kind in that simple, decent way that makes you wonder if goodness still exists. He paid little, but I didn't care. I liked the smell of bread again. It reminded me of the version
Slowly,
of
I
myself
built a life,
that used to
fragile,
dream.
small,
Weeks passed.
but mine.
I rented the room by the month, bought second-hand clothes, even smiled at neighbors. But every night, I took out my mother's letter and read it again, as if the words might change and reveal something new. They never did, until one day they did. It was a Sunday morning when a man came into the bakery. Tall, gray at the
He
temples,
ordered
coffee,
wearing a
and
blue
a loaf
shirt
of bread
that looked too
then
clean
looked
for
at
someone
me for
his
a moment
age.
too long. You look familiar, he said. I froze, unsure if I should answer. Were you from here? He asked. I shook my head. No, from Belo Horizonte. He nodded slowly. You remind me of someone I knew there once. Something inside me tightened. Who? I asked, trying to sound casual. He smiled faintly. Do you
A
know
woman
her?
named Helena.
For a moment,
She worked
the
at
world
a clothing
tilted.
shop near
I
the
felt
Central
my heart
Market.
stop. Always
Then race.
smelled of
My
lavender.
hands trembled so hard, I almost dropped the bread tongue. I forced a breath. She was my mother. The man blinked, as if I had spoken a word he'd buried long ago. He whispered, Your mother. And then, very quietly, more days. We stood there in silence. The sound of the radio, the chatter
The
of
name left
customers,
my lips like a
everything
confession.
around us faded.
He nodded
Finally,
slowly,
he
his
said,
eyes glistening.
What's your
She
name,
told me
Clara?
she had a daughter once, but I never believed she meant mine. I felt dizzy. My throat tightened. You knew her. I loved her, he said simply. And I left because I thought she didn't. He told me his name, Antonio Ribeiro. He had left Belo Horizonte in 1968, chasing work in Sao Paulo. He never knew about me,
thinking my
we
mother
sat
would
on a
join
bench
him.
outside
When
the
she
bakery
didn't, for hours,
he assumed
he
she'd
told me
chosen
about his
someone
life.
else. They
The
never
factory
spoke
jobs,
again.
the small apartment, the years he spent wondering what might have.
And I told him pieces of mine, carefully, gently, leaving out the darkest parts. But even in silence, I think he sensed the truth. Before leaving, He said something I'll never forget. I can't change the years we lost. She didn't hide you out of shame,
but I can tell
she
you
hid you
this.
out of
Your
love.
mother was brave.
I wanted to believe. I wanted those words to heal something. But healing is never that simple. After he left, I sat alone for a long time, feeling the weight of everything I'd just learned. My real father had found me, not through searching, not through fate, but by sheer accident. And yet, it didn't feel like the ending of something. Because
It felt
like
meeting
the
him
beginning of
didn't
another
erase
truth
the years of
I wasn't
silence,
ready to face.
or the fear,
or the promise I broke. It didn't erase the fact that somewhere, back in that small house in Belo Horizonte, there was still a man who believed I was his, a man who would soon find out I was gone. And when he did, I knew he wouldn't let it end quietly. It started with the phone call. 2 months had passed since I met Antonio.
I was beginning
since
to
I'd
settle
learned the
into
truth
the rhythm
that
of my
should
new
have
life.
freed me. I
But
woke somehow
before
made the air
sunrise,
heavier, baked the first loaf, swept the flour dust from the counters, and went home to my little room with sore feet and a sense of quiet that almost felt like peace. Then, one evening in late August, the phone behind the bakery counter rang. It was strange. Few people ever called there, and fewer still asked for me. I took the
Morrow
receiver,
answered,
my hand
frowning,
damp with sweat,
then turned
Hello.
toward me.
At
Clara,
first,
Algum
there was
Provoca.
only breathing, then a voice, rough, slow, unmistakable. You think you can just disappear. My heart stopped. I didn't need to hear more. I knew that voice too well. My father. I froze, unable to speak. He laughed, not the kind that comes from humor, but from hurt and rage tangled together. You
I
left
tried
me
to
to
hang
rot,
up,
girl.
but he kept
After
talking,
everything
his
I
voice
did for
rising.
you think
Everything
the
he
truth
did,
changes
the
anything?
words made
you
my
think I
stomach
didn't
turn.
know. I froze. Know what? I whispered. He chuckled, dry, bitter. You think your mother was clever, hiding her sins in a letter? I knew long before she did. I just let her live with it. And you were the proof. The world blurred. My fingers trembled around the receiver. Why didn't you ever? Because I wanted her to suffer, he said, voice breaking into something almost feral. Every time I looked at you, I saw him. And every time I saw him, I remembered that I stayed, that she didn't. I hung up before he could finish. My knees gave out, and I slid down against the wall, shaking so violently that the phone cord rattled beside me. I could still hear his voice echoing
He'd
in my
known
head all along.
the venom,
Every silence,
the confession,
every stare,
the years of
every
hidden
act
cruelty
of control,
suddenly making
it
sense.
hadn't been ignorance. It had been punishment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his words. He knew. He had built his whole life around hating to ghosts. The man my mother loved, and the daughter who reminded him of it. And I had been the collateral damage. 3 days later, I saw him. It was a Saturday morning. I had just opened the bakery, and
when
there
the
he
bell
was,
above the door
standing
jingled.
in the doorway. Older, thinner, his clothes wrinkled, his face gray from the road. But those eyes, those same sharp, cold eyes, hadn't changed. My breath caught. How did you find me? I whispered. He shrugged. The world's smaller than you think. He stepped closer,
and I took a step back. The smell of alcohol
For a
followed him
moment,
like a shadow.
I saw something
His voice
human
softened,
in him,
almost
something broken.
trembling. But
You
then
left
it
me
twisted,
alone,
darkening
Clara,
again.
just like
You
your mother
belong
did.
with me, he said. You owe me that much. No, I said, my voice low, steadier than I expected. I don't owe you anything. He laughed again, shaking his head. You have her tongue, too. Lying, lying, always lying. Please leave, I said, louder this time. People had begun to glance, maybe realizing that the world wasn't his jaw anymore, that he couldn't control me here. His hand trembled, then dropped to his side. Don't think this ends with you running away, he muttered. You'll see. The world doesn't forget what you are. And then he left, just turned, and walked into the sun, disappearing into the crowded street. I stood there, shaking, unable to move. The smell of baked bread mixed with the stench of old fare, but I couldn't answer. I felt like the walls were closing in again, the air too thick, the ground too soft. That night, I packed my things out again. I didn't know where I'd go, only that I couldn't stay. I found Antonio the next day and told him everything. The call, the visit, the truth my father had confessed. His face went pale, but I didn't believe him for a long because time. Men like then my he father said quietly, didn't need to touch You're you safe to now. You. He can't hurt you anymore. In the way you flinched at kindness, in the way your body remembered every unspoken threat. That night, Antonio offered me a small apartment above his workshop. I hesitated, afraid to accept, afraid to trust. But something in his eyes reminded me of the part of my mother that had loved him. It never came. And I said yes. Maybe he had finally given up. I waited for another call. He had simply run out of ways to hurt me. Still, some nights, when I lay in bed, I swore I could hear his voice, faint, distant, calling my name through the dark. And every time I did, I whispered back to the silence, you can't reach me anymore. But I didn't know then that the past never really dies. It only changes its days voice, and Monty's sorrows began to find a new way to speak, fragile but promising. I worked at the bakery during morning, returned to my small apartment above Antonio's workshop in the afternoon, and at night I allowed myself, finally, to breathe. The air didn't feel thick with fear anymore. The walls didn't press down on me. And yet, the letter from my mother, folded carefully in my dresser drawer, wasn't just my father. Reminded me every day of the promise. It was the weight of all the impossible promises, their silent manipulations, their lies. But even free, I felt a strange debt, not to him, but to her, my mother, whose life had been shaped by fear and love, whose decisions had trapped me in years I would never get back. One evening, I found myself walking along the river that cut through the town. I thought the water reflected the dying light of the sun, of all the trembling like a mirror of my own instead of cry, of the years I had given to someone who was never truly mine. And for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge anger, pure, sharp anger. But alongside it was something stranger, compassion. I remembered her hand, the way they trembled while folding clothes,
The way she kissed my forehead
She had
when I
survived
was
her
small.
own life of
The way
fear
she
and
whispered in the
lies.
dark
And
that
now she had
everything
left
would
me
be
to
okay.
survive mine.
That debt to her courage, her memory, her sacrifice weighed on me more heavily than any promise to a man who had never deserved it. Over the next few weeks, I began to write letters to her, although I had no address to send them to. I wrote in a small notebook, pouring out years of sorrow. Sometimes I read them aloud
and
to
fear.
the mango tree outside my window, imagining her listening, smiling softly. It became a ritual. The only way I could process the tangled emotion that had been kept locked in my chest for decades. One afternoon, Antonio noticed the notebook on the table. He asked about it, and I hesitated, unsure if I should reveal the deepest corners of my soul to anyone.
That night,
but he didn't
I
cry.
felt lighter,
He simply
as
nodded,
if speaking,
understanding
even to
in
an
a quiet,
absent presence,
patient way, had begun to untangle the knots in my chest. And then the past found a new way to intrude. A letter arrived at the bakery, addressed to me, written in my father's unmistakable handwriting. I froze as I held it, my fingers trembling. Part of me wanted to tear it, to crush it, to forget its existence entirely. But
Inside,
I couldn't. Some invisible force
not
compelled
remorse,
me to read.
not
Apology, not regret, only accusation and control disguised as care. You think you can run forever. You belong to me. You owe me everything, and I will not let you forget it. The words burned like fire across my chest. I slammed the letter shut, my hands shaking violently. I realized then that no matter how far I ran, no matter how many miles I now had a choice to let it consume me or to face it with the only weapon I had ever truly honed, my courage. I packed the letter carefully into a drawer beneath the notebook of letters to my mother. I whispered to the darkened apartment, I am not yours, I am hers, and I am my own. And in that moment, I understood the truth I had been avoiding for years. Freedom means acknowledging escaping the past, holding it in your hands, and choosing how it shapes you moving forward. I would face him again, I knew, and perhaps not with swords or fists, but with something far more terrifying. The truth I had carried in silence for so long, sharpened by years of fear into something unbreakable. The sun dipped behind the mountain that evening, casting long shadows across the town. I stood at my window, the breeze carrying the scent of bread from the bakery below and mango from the tree outside. I was afraid, yes, but no longer helpless, and somewhere in the quiet, I allowed myself to smile, not the practiced smile of survival, but a real one, trembling but undeniable, because surviving isn't just about hiding. It's about finally standing in the open, letting the wind touch you, and knowing that no one, not even fear, not even blood, can take away what you choose to own. It happened sooner than I expected. I had begun to think the years of fear and manipulation were finally behind me, that the distance, the bus rides, the new city, and the small victories had created a bubble where my past could no longer touch me.
but some things refuse to be ignored. Them directly. It was a Monday morning. The bakery smelled of fresh bread, the air humid with yeast, and the faint sweetness of sugar. I was arranging pastries in the display when I felt it, a presence at the door that made my stomach tighten the way it had when I was a child and heard his footsteps on the stairs. I froze, slowly, cautiously, and there he was, turned, my father, older, thinner, but with the same cold gaze that had haunted me for years. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The silence in the bakery became heavy, pressing against my chest. Customers stopped, noticing the tension. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and unrelenting, as he stepped closer. His eyes flicked over the bread, the counter, then landed on
you
me.
could escape,
But
he
you
said,
can't run
voice
from me
low,
forever. But
I
sharp
swallowed,
enough to cut
forcing
glass.
myself
You
to
thought
meet
you
his
could hide.
gaze.
I'm not yours, I said quietly, but with steady breath. I never was, and I never will be, he sneered, a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. Don't play games. You owe me. You've always owed me. All those years, all that silence. It was for me. No, I said again, and for my
Louder
mother
this time,
who had
it
the
was for
courage
survival,
you never
and I
understood.
survived.
Not
His face
for you,
twisted,
not
and
for
for the
anyone.
first
For
time,
me, I saw something in him. Confusion, perhaps even fear. The control he had always wielded so effortlessly was faltered. My voice grew stronger, fueled by every stolen childhood, every forced smile. Every night I whispered in the dark that one day I'd be free. I learned the truth. I'm done living in your shadows about everything you and my mother not tried to hide. And it doesn't matter anymore, threatening. But I didn't flinch. The years of training my body to react to fear, the years of perfecting my survival, had been for this moment. I felt the power of owning my story, of speaking the words I had rehearsed alone for decades. Finally, after what felt like eternity, he paused. The rage his that hand dropped from the counter seemed to evaporate into a quiet, hollow empty. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see the child or the shadow of my mother or even the girl he thought he controlled. He saw me, whole, unbroken, untouchable. He started, then faltered. I didn't wait for an apology that would never come. I stepped past him. The air was warm, walked out scented with bread and dust, felt the sun hit my face like a baptism. For the first time, I could breathe without hesitation, without fear. The past had come to knock. I had answered, and in doing so, I realized that the power I had been running from was never his to wield. It had always been mine to reclaim. I turned back once, just long enough to see him standing in the doorway, the weight of the streets and regret Claros stretched before me. Then I walked full away, of possibilities, my steps steady. I had once my heart dreamed of, and for the first time, truly, I felt the unshakable truth. Surviving isn't living, thriving is. And now, for the first time in my life, I was ready to thrive. Years have passed since that day. Years I never thought I would live fully, freely, without the weight of fear pressing against my chest.
The bakery,
Monte's
the
small
Claus
apartment
home,
above Antonio's
in a way
workshop,
no city ever
the mango
had
tree
before.
outside my window. They are threads in the tapestry of a life I've slowly, painfully stitched together from fragments of loss, courage, and defiance. I've learned that freedom is not a sudden door opening, but a series of small choices, one after the other. Choosing to leave, choosing to speak, choosing to live in the sunlight instead of the shadows. Not because it hides fear, but because it affirms life. Sometimes I think of my mother, and I close my eyes to see her, her hands folded over mine, her whisper in the dark, her unwavering strength. She gave me life, yes, but she also gave me a lesson in resilience that no words or letters could fully capture. Every act of survival, every night
Not
spent
with
pretending,
anger,
every
not with
trembling
hatred,
breath I once
those
called
emotions
weakness
belong to the
was
past.
a step toward
I
the
think of
person
him
I am now.
as a
I
reminder
think
of the
my
power
father
of
too.
choice.
He showed me what it means to be trapped by fear, to let bitterness shape every action. But I refuse that path. I refuse to let his shadow linger in my life. I owe him nothing, and in that refusal, I found my greatest strength. Antonio remains a quiet presence. He never tried to replace what I lost, that never had taught me to distrust even the wind. He simply offered space, trust, and a hand to hold when the nights grew long. In him, I found a reflection of the life I could have, shaped by love rather than fear. And me? I am learning to live in ways I never knew were possible. I laugh without guilt. I cry without shame. I walk through the streets with my head held high, knowing that every scar, every trembling moment, every stolen smile has been transformed into a testament of survival. Sometimes, when the wind moves through the mango tree outside my window, I think I can hear my mother's voice, soft and patient. You've done it. You're free now. And in those moments, I smile, not the mask I wore for years, but
one
the
that
real
carries
every hurt and every triumph, every loss and every discovery in a quiet, unshakable strength. I learned that survival is only the beginning. True life comes when you claim it for yourself, when you confront the shadows, when you honor the past without letting it control you. And now, I carry that knowledge in my bones, in my heartbeat, in every step I take forward. I learned to smile for fear. I have learned to survive for love, fiercely, and without apology. The past will always be a part of, but it no longer defines. And for the first time, I feel a profound, unshakable peace, because I am mine, and that, finally, is enough.